Hi everyone. This week's lecture focuses on Sarah Ahmed's essay, Home and Away, Narrative of Migration and Estrangement, and Zadie Smith's WhiteTeeth. Sarah Ahmed's essay, Home and Away, and Zadie Smith's WhiteTeeth both engage with themes of migration, hybridity, and belonging, examining how individuals navigate identity in a world shaped by displacement and cultural intersection. These works illuminate the complex journeys individuals embark on as they strive to forge their identities within a world rife with displacement and the dynamic interplay of diverse cultural landscapes. Ahmed explores the notion of home to better understand the intricate relationship between migration and identity. She critiques scholars like Ian Chambers and Rosie Bardotti, whose approaches tend to simplify migration or detach it from the specific circumstances that shape it. These approaches, she argues, dismiss the rich historical, temporal, and spatial contexts that inform migrants' experience and can perpetuate a misleading binary of authentic versus inauthentic journeys. In the following passage, we see how Ahmed questions Chambers' kind of approach to the study of migration. I quote her here. What is problematic about Chambers' narrative is not simply the fact that the differences between histories of movement are erased under the sign of migrancy, but also the slippage between literal migration and metaphoric migration. Literal migration suggests the physical movement of bodies within and across spaces. Indeed, there is no clear and obvious referent here. To talk about migration literally is to open oneself to the complex and contingent histories of the movements of people across borders. Chambers' narrative refuses to take migration literally. Instead, migration becomes a metaphor for the very process of dislocation. This act of metaphorizing migration, in some sense, repeats the very process of migration, which involves a dislocation from place. In this sense, to use migration as metaphor is to migrate from migration, such that it becomes an impossible metaphor that no longer refers to the dislocation from place, but dislocation as such. Thought already dislocates. This is from Ahmed's essay on page 332 to 333. Rather than reducing migrants to stereotypical figures as seen in Chambers' work or using them merely as symbols for intellectual exploration, as Bardotti suggests, Ahmed investigates how quote-unquote patterns of estrangement are historically rooted, emphasizing how the notion of home influences the perspectives of those who have departed from it. Her insight contributes significantly to diaspora studies by insisting on the importance of understanding diasporic experiences within their historical and contextual frameworks, a stance that positions her as a thoughtful scholar who brings together post-colonial theory and diaspora studies. Robin Cohn. Let's take a look at the following passage where Ahmed talks about the definition of home with regards to her critique of Chambers and Bardotti's work. In both Chambers and Bardotti's work, home is not given any positive definition. It is constructed only through reference to what it is not, that is, through reference to the homelessness of migration and exile. By being defined negatively in this way, home henceforth becomes associated with stasis, boundaries, identity, and fixity. Home is implicitly constructed as a purified space of belonging in which the subject is too comfortable to question the limits or borders of her or his experience. Indeed, where the subject is so at ease that she or he does not think. Such a construction of home as too familiar, safe, and comfortable to allow for critical thought has clear resonance in some post-colonial literature. This is from Ahmed's essay on page 339. Ahmed responds, In other words, it is through an uncommon estrangement that the possibility of such a migrant community comes to be lived. The gap between memory and place in the very dislocation of migration allows communities to be formed. That gap becomes rework as a site of bodily transformation. The potential to remake one's relation to that which appears as unfamiliar, to re-inhabit spaces and places. This rehabilitation of the migrant body is enabled through gestures of friendship with others who are already known as not known, strangers. It is the role of community in the recreation of migrant selves that is so important. The community comes to life through the collective act of remembering in the absence of a common terrain. This is on Ahmed's essay on page 344. In a sense, Ahmed redefines home, pushing back against the idea that it is purely about familiarity. She highlights that nations can also be perceived as quote-unquote homes, where the interplay of the familiar and unfamiliar fundamentally shapes the experience of space. Here, I want to highlight Ahmed's use of a metaphor in this essay, a very interesting metaphor, that of the second skin. Let's take a look at what she says here. This is her quote from page 341. The immersion of a self in a locality is henceforth not simply about inhabiting an already constituted space from which one can simply depart and remain the same. Rather, the locality intrudes into the senses. It defines what one smells, hears, touches, feels, remembers. The lived experience of being at home hence involves the enveloping of subjects in a space which is not simply outside dumb. Being at home suggests that the subject and space leak into each other, inhabiting each other. To some extent, we can think of the lived experience of being at home in terms of inhabiting a second skin, a skin which does not simply contain the homely subject, but which allows the subject to be touched and touch the world that is neither simply in the home or away from home. The home as skin suggests the boundary between self and home is permeable, but also that the boundary between home and away is permeable as well. Here, movement away is also movement within the constitution of home as such. That is, movement away is always effective. It affects how, quote unquote, homely one might feel and fail to feel. Ahmed here conceptualizes a sense of belonging as an embodied phenomenon, akin to a second skin. This embodiment reflects individuals' sensory connections to their environments and illustrates how both the individual and the space influence one another across the boundaries of that skin. When people migrate, they effectively divide the idea of home into two parts: their origins and the new realities they navigate. For Ahmed, the notions of home and migration are intertwined with how individuals occupy certain spaces at specific times. Migration inherently leads to a disconnection from the previous home. She contrasts this sense of estrangement experienced by migrants with that of more privileged travelers who can cultivate kinship through shared experiences in communities of strangers. In contrast, migrants often face uncommon estrangement arising from a lack of common ground or shared history, which she describes as a void. They must adapt to these unfamiliar environments, learning to re-inhabit them and forge new communities based on their mutual experiences and connections. While Ahmed acknowledges that for many, returning home is not feasible, since the concept of home intertwines with both place and time, she concludes her exploration by suggesting that these new relationships and gestures can pave the way for the emergence of new commonalities and communities. In the following, I'll discuss Zadie Smith WhiteTeeth along with Sarah Ahmed's Home and Away with 4 thematic focuses. First, the theme of home and migration. Second, hybridity and displacement. Third, belonging and otherness. Fourth, memory and diaspora. Home and migration. Ahmed delves into the idea that home transcends a physical location, evolving into an emotional journey shaped by personal and shared histories. In WhiteTeeth, this complexity is illustrated through the immigrant characters. For example, Samad Iqbal desires an idealized version of Bangladeshi identity even after migrating to and building a family in London. Contrarily, his British-born children, Majid and Milad, navigate a more flexible understanding of home that is informed by second-hand memories of their parents. However, Majid's sense of home becomes even more complicated after being sent, quote-unquote, back to Bangladesh. Another example is Irie Jones, the daughter of Archie and Clara Jones. Conscious of her mixed British-Jamaican identity, Irie embodies a search for belonging that reflects Ahmed's claim that one's understanding of the experience of home is not simply inherited. It requires active negotiation to establish a new sense of community imagined through the unfamiliar. On the theme of hybridity and displacement, Ahmed argues that migration engenders a dual sense of estrangement where the home concept becomes familiar and unfamiliar. This theme manifests in WhiteTeeth through Samad's ambivalent emotions between his discontent with British society and his fear regarding his son's loss of their Bangladeshi roots. His decision to send Majid back to Bangladesh to make him more Bangladeshi ironically leads to Majid becoming more English than Milad, the other twin who has stayed behind in the UK. Let's take a look at this passage where Samad vents to Irie about his 2 sons. There are no words. The one I sent home comes out a Bukka Englishman, white-suited, silly wig lawyer. The one I keep here is fully paid up, green bow tie wearing fundamentalist terrorist. I sometimes wonder why I bother, said Samad bitterly, betraying the English inflections of 20 years in the country. I really do. These days, it feels to me like you make a devil's pact when you walk into this country. You hand over your passport at the check-in, you get stamped, you want to make a little money, get yourself started, but you mean to go back? Who would want to stay? Cold, wet, miserable, terrible food, dreadful newspapers. Who would want to stay? In a place where you are never welcome, only tolerated, just tolerated. Like you are an animal finally housebroken. Who would want to stay? But you have made a devil's pact. It drags you in and suddenly you are unsuitable to return. Your children are unrecognizable. You belong nowhere. And this is Irie's response. Oh, that's not true, Shirley. So the unexpected fate of Majid and Milad underscores that there is no fixed pattern to diasporic experience shaped by migration and cultural hybridity. This is the message that we get from WhiteTeeth. Smith's portrayal of racial tensions and cultural struggles of migrants in the UK exemplifies what Ahmed explores as the question of how one feels or how one might fail to feel. We see this in the characters of the second-generation immigrants, Milad and Irie. Milad stands at the crossroads of British youth culture and Islamic extremism, while Irie grapples with her own racial identity. They embody the affective experience of being caught between belonging and alienation. They are double-bind in seeking identification and acceptance in their home nation and maintaining ties to the ancestral homeland leads to the challenge of the perceptions of British national identity and questions who truly belongs in multicultural England. This is an example of what kind of youth Milad is. This is on the day when there was a storm. The family had lost their electricity, and Samad was gathering Milad and Alsana together, getting ready to drive to Archie's place. They gather the important things they want to gather in order to run away from the storm, and this is from Samad's point of view, what Milad and Alsana brought with them. So we can clearly see from this that Milad is a youth who is very much influenced by British and American popular culture. So you have Robert De Niro's posters from his movie Taxi Driver and Bruce Springsteen's album Born to Run. But this following example is a very concrete example of how Milad is an individual caught in between two distinct cultures that somehow conflicts with one another. So let's take a look at this passage. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I want to highlight a couple of places. So here, in fact, the problem with Milad's subconscious, and he didn't need Marjorie to tell him this, was that it was basically split level. On the one hand, he was trying real hard to live as he found, and the others suggested. This involved getting his head around four main criteria. First, to be ascetic in one's habit, cut down on the booze, the weed, the women. Two, to remember always the glory of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the might of the Creator. Three, to grasp a full intellectual understanding of Kevin and the Quran. Kevin, the group, the fundamentalist group that he belongs to. Four, to purge oneself of the taint of the West. He knew that he was Kevin's big experiment, and he wanted to give it his best shot. In the first three areas, he was doing fine. He smoked the old fag and put away a Guinness on occasion. Can't say fairer than that. But he was very successful with both the evil weed and the temptations of the flesh. So everyone at Kevin was mightily impressed. So far as good. As for Kevin's more unorthodox programs of direct action, Milad was right in there. He was their great asset. He was in the forefront, the first in to battle, calm jihad, cool as F in crisis, a man of action, like Brando, like Pacino, like Lolita. But even as Milad proudly reflected on this while in his mother's hallway, his heart sank. For therein lay the problem. Number 4, purging oneself of the West. Now, he knew that if you wanted an example of the moribund, decadent, degenerate, over sex, violent state of Western capitalist culture and the logic endpoint of its obsession with personal freedoms, leaflet way out west, you couldn't do much better than Hollywood cinema. And he knew how many times had he been through it with Hifans. That the gangsters movie, the mafia genre, was the worst example of that. And yet, it was the hardest thing to let go. He would give every spliff he had ever smoked and every woman he had ever effed to retrieve the films his mother had burned, or even the few he had purchased more recently that Hifan had confiscated. This is a very concrete example to show the kind of internal struggle, the kind of double bind, the conflict that Milad experienced at this stage of his life. As a youth that bought into the kind of British youth culture, and one who is leaning towards Islamic fundamentalism. Last, I want to talk about the theme of memory and nostalgia in WhiteTeeth. Nostalgia is an effective product of memory. Ahmed examines how migrants often construct and cling to an imagined version of home that is comforting and unattainable. Nostalgia is that feeling of longing and desire. In WhiteTeeth, Samad and Alsana idealize a Bangladesh that no longer exists, similar to Archie's distorted recollections of the war. Their longing for a romanticized past inhibits their ability to engage with the present and integrate into British society and culture. The conflict between memory and actual lived experiences also sometimes drives a rift between them and their children. I apologize for going a little over time with the supposedly 20 minutes lecture, but there's so much to talk about, and I don't think I gave enough credit to both the essay and the text for quickly running through some of these ideas. So, in conclusion, WhiteTeeth exemplifies the pushback against fixed definitions of home Ahmed discusses in her article. Through the characters' experiences, the novel suggests that identity is forged through movement, estrangement, and cultural convergence. Zadie Smith's WhiteTeeth exemplifies how the notion of home is shaped by both longing and the necessity for adaptation. The inability to seek balance between the two leads to extremism.